This isn't just going to be another story about an old warplane. I want you to think of this as a blueprint, a kind of case study, really. It's about what happens when a deeply held, powerful belief, the idea that the human spirit can conquer absolutely anything, runs headfirst into a piece of technology that just doesn't care. This is a story about how a machine didn't just help win at war, but how it systematically took apart the very soul of a warrior culture. So, let's start with a question, and I really want you to think about this. Imagine for a second that you are the absolute best in the world at what you do. You've been trained to a razor's edge, you're disciplined, and you are spiritually convinced that you are superior. Then, one day, something new shows up. Something that doesn't follow the rules. Something that makes your entire lifetime of skill completely and utterly irrelevant. So what do you do? The answer to that question literally changed a nation. Okay, let's get into it. All right, so to really grasp the sheer earth-shattering shock of what's about to happen, we have to go back and understand the absolute confidence that existed before. In the early days of the war in the Pacific, the sky, it belonged to the pilots of the Imperial Japanese Navy. And these guys weren't just pilots. They were seen as aerial samurai, true artists of the dogfight. And they flew what was, without a doubt, the finest fighter plane in the world at the time, the legendary Mitsubishi A6M Zero. Now let's really break down what it took to become one of these guys. These men weren't just trained, they were forged in fire. We're talking about a selection program, the Yokonaran, with an acceptance rate under 2%. I mean, that makes getting into an Ivy League school look like a walk in the park. And it was infinitely more brutal. The few who made it through had, on average, over 800 hours of flight time before they ever saw combat. That's about 4 times what their American counterparts had. But the key, the real secret weapon, was their philosophy. A deeply held belief rooted in the warrior code of Bushido that their spirit, their will to win, was a weapon far more powerful than any amount of steel an enemy could build. And for a while, they were absolutely terrifyingly right. And here is the proof. In 1942, that philosophy produced this almost unbelievable number. For every single Zero that was shot down, 12 Allied fighters, American, British, Australian, were sent spiraling out of the sky. 12 to 1. You have to understand, this wasn't just a number on a report. This was total validation of their entire worldview. It was proof that their spirit was superior. They could outturn, outfly, and outfight anything the world threw at them. They weren't just pilots, they were the apex predators of the Pacific. And then, something new appeared on the horizon, a strange, dark blue shape. It was big, powerful, and it had these weird bent wings, these inverted gull wings. It just didn't look right. And as they would soon find out, it sure as hell didn't fight by the rules they had mastered. This was the F4U Corsair, and the entire equation of the air war was about to be rewritten permanently. Picture this. It's Valentine's Day, 1943. A group of veteran Japanese pilots spot these new fighters. They move in for the kill, expecting the usual dance, that elegant turning ballet of a dogfight they had perfected. But the Corsair does something that just breaks their brains. It doesn't turn. It simply points its nose at the sky and climbs. And it keeps climbing, rocketing right past them, still accelerating at altitudes where their own Zeros felt sluggish and weak. It was a terrifying moment of revelation. This new enemy wasn't going to dance with them. It was going to dictate the terms of the fight from a place they couldn't even reach. And this is where the psychological part of this story really kicks in. See, a Zero pilot's entire identity was built on his mastery of that close-in, turning fight. But the Corsair just refused to play that game. It's like, imagine you've spent your entire life becoming the world's greatest swordsman and your opponent just shows up with a machine gun. All that skill, all that training, all that artistry, it suddenly means nothing. The Corsair would just appear from above, strike with incredible speed, and then vanish back up into the sky, a place they simply could not follow. So that initial shock, that confusion, well, it was about to get a whole lot worse. Because what followed wasn't a contest of skill anymore. It became a contest of mathematics. The Corsair wasn't just a different plane. It was the product of a totally different philosophy of war. And for the proud pilots of the Zero, the hunters were about to become the hunted. Okay, let's get into the nuts and bolts here, because the numbers, well, they tell a really brutal story. It's not just that the Corsair's engine had almost double the horsepower. Think about what that really means. It means it could climb higher and faster. In an air combat, the pilot who controls the altitude controls the fight, period. But look at that dive speed. The Corsair could plummet out of the sun at over 500 miles an hour, a speed that would literally tear the wings off of a Zero. And this is the crucial part. The Zero pilot lost all control, all agency. He could no longer choose when and where to fight. His only choice was to wait for the blow to fall. And when that blow did fall, it was just overwhelming. The Corsair's 6.50 caliber machine guns could throw nearly 7 pounds of metal at a target in a single second. Just look at that difference. We're talking about a 530% advantage. A 1-second burst from a Corsair wasn't just damaging, it was enough to completely shred the lightweight, unarmored Zero, turning it from a deadly fighter into a cloud of smoke and debris. But you know what? This might be the single most important and maybe the most soul-crushing difference of all. It boils down to two totally different design philosophies. The Zero was a masterpiece of agility because it was built with nothing to protect the pilot. No armor, no self-sealing fuel tanks. Its greatest strength was also its fatal flaw. The Corsair, on the other hand, was a flying tank. It was designed from the ground up with the core mission: bring the pilot home. So an American pilot could make a mistake, take some hits, and live to fight and learn another day. For the Zero pilot, there was no room for error. One mistake, just one well-placed bullet, and it was over. You don't have to take my word for it. Listen to what Kenneth Walsh, the very first Corsair ace, said about it. The Corsair made aerial combat unfair. It became mechanical. He's saying it right there. The human element, the warrior's art, the skill he had been trained for, it was being engineered right out of the equation. Combat was no longer a beautiful, deadly duel. It was becoming a mechanical process. You climb, you dive, you shoot, you escape, and you repeat it until the other guy is gone. So let's zoom out for a second. We've talked about the machine, the numbers, but what about the man in the cockpit? What happens to a person's spirit, to their entire belief system, when they are faced with that kind of mechanical slaughter, day after day after day? It's not just airplanes that are falling out of the sky anymore. An entire philosophy, the very pillar of a warrior identity, is being demolished by the cold, hard logic of American steel. To understand the depth of this crisis, you have to understand this one core idea: Yamato Damashi, or the Japanese spirit. This wasn't just a motivational phrase. It was the unwavering belief that their willpower, their unique courage and fighting soul was a literal, tangible force. A force that could overcome any material disadvantage against an enemy who was seen as spiritually inferior. It was the software they believed would always, always defeat the enemy's hardware. And the Corsair was the ultimate, brutal counterargument to that belief. It was a flying, screaming 2,000 horsepower lesson in physics, and the lesson was this: your spirit is incredible, but it cannot stop a 50 caliber round. Your willpower is strong, but it cannot outclimb a supercharged engine. Your courage offers exactly zero protection when your unsealed fuel tank erupts into a fireball. The very foundation of their identity was being proven false in the most violent way imaginable. So where do you go from there? When your core belief is shattered, when your tactics are useless, and when flying into combat is basically a death sentence, what's left? Well, this is the tragic, but in a strange way, logical path to desperation. The kill ratio completely inverted, soaring to 15-1 against Japan. So the kamikaze was born. And it wasn't born from madness. It was born from a cold, hard calculation. If death is almost certain, the only variable you can still control is the meaning of your death. The goal was no longer to win the fight. It was simply to not die for nothing. And the story doesn't end when the fighting stops. Not at all. The shock waves from this one machine, they echoed far beyond the battlefield. The lesson that the Corsair taught, that industrial power is the ultimate arbiter of modern war, would go on to profoundly reshape Japan's entire national identity for generations. This right here, this graph, is what industrial warfare really looks like. The Corsair and planes like it weren't just killing pilots, they were systematically erasing a generation of expertise. Japan's veteran aces were being wiped out so fast that training just collapsed. Think about it. By 1945, you're sending teenagers with maybe 40 hours of flight time up against American veterans with 600 hours, flying a superior machine. That's not combat. It's an industrial process of attrition. And if you want to know how that was possible, this is it. This is the engine behind the engine. America didn't just build a better plane, it built them on a scale that was simply incomprehensible. I mean, just look at these numbers.
the US produced more of just this one type of plane than Japan built of all of its fighters combined in the last 3 years of the war. The war was being won on the assembly lines in Connecticut and California, long before the planes even took off.
And maybe the most powerful testimony of all comes from the other side, from Saburo Sakai, one of the greatest Japanese aces to survive the war. What he's saying here is just devastating. The Corsair, which they nicknamed Whistling Death, became a psychological weapon. By the end, the mere sight of it, the mere shape of those bent wings on the horizon, was enough to shatter the will to fight. Not because these pilots were cowards, but because they were realists. They knew engaging was suicide.
So, what's the big takeaway here? It's that the F4U Corsair was more than just an airplane. It was an argument, and it was an argument that it won, decisively. The argument was that in the modern world, the nation with the best engineers and the biggest factories will always defeat the nation with the bravest warriors. It was a philosophical debate, settled with 6.50 caliber machine guns.
And that brings us right back to today, right back to us. Because it's easy to look back with hindsight and see the blind spot those pilots had. They were completely convinced of their spiritual and skillful superiority, right up until the moment a machine showed up that made it all irrelevant. So we have to ask ourselves, what are our blind spots? What are the core beliefs we hold about our own strengths today, our creativity, our intuition, our humanity? And what is the Corsair, be it AI, autonomous systems, some technology we can't even name yet, that's being designed in a lab somewhere right now that could render all of our greatest strengths obsolete? Now that is a question worth thinking about.